People at your job can certainly be in a private competition with you and you don't even know it. I so want to respond to this comment. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones, and I've worked in the mental health field for several years. I appreciate what you's name has said here. I find some people are competitive and they sign you up to a competition you know nothing about. If you're good at your job and unknowingly don't play the game, again, you know nothing about the competition that they have with you. Thank you so much for this. This is so true. And one of those key points that I forgot to mention is that people do become clinical and people become angry and nasty with you, even in the clinical field. One of the things that I've noticed as people, like, not just people who work in the clinical field, right, or work as clinicians, but also people who work in other fields. So and I'll kind of expand on this by going into detail about some scenarios that I've encountered, like when I've been at work. I have a reputation for working with the difficult to treat or resistant clients. I also have a reputation for being able to interview clients that maybe be going through something and they won't share it with their own clinician, right? So I'm a great interviewer, especially around sexual assault, especially with those who are intellectually impaired. And I did an interview with a guy and helped him with his patient, blah blah blah. And do you know that guy, his patient didn't talk to him. He talked to me and he was so upset with that, right? He was grateful for it the day of, but then he came back and he was seething, ever since that. And, it just made it his mission to undercut me with my supervisor and cause all kinds of just silly little problems. But there's that. I've also had people that, that get upset with me outside of work, just that that work with me but don't work in the same space that I do. So one example would be I had a colleague that I considered to be a friend at the time. And let me tell you about one of the things that happens to me a lot when people find out what I do. They're kind of like, if someone hears about me before coming to an event, or if they hear, someone's like, oh, I'm going to bring Dr. or Natalie or whatever, and then they tell them about me. And then when I arrive, a lot of times what happens, actually, this has happened to me quite a bit. Sometimes people will just start walking up to me and they'll start crying. Or they'll start confessing like some deep dark secrets, like, hi, my name is, and then it's just like blah, 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 just like vomit. And it just happens quite a bit. And they're just like, I want to tell you. And like, people, I'm not even like joking when I say people like spill like serious stuff, like a suicide, their deepest dark, whatever the case, they just do it. And it's like, holy crap. And so I had a colleague that introduced me to her mother, and I guess her and her mother weren't on good terms. And so when she introduced me to her mother did something very similar to that. And that colleague was so livid with me, and she just was like, I don't like you anymore. And so it just became a point of contention. So there's that. But, again, so those are two very different, but very similar scenarios. But people want to compete, and so there is this sort of like meanness, and there's like this like invisible game that they have going. But if things aren't going their way, they definitely want to sabotage you. Part of the way that they sabotage you is definitely a smear campaign with your other colleagues, but also a smear campaign with your boss. They're keeping track. What time are you going into work, or what time are you, did you take a long lunch, or did you clock out early, and I'm going to report that back. Or they're kind of going in and scrutinizing your work, and they're trying to find and make problems when there really isn't any. But again, if you're a minority, and I was definitely a minority where I worked, there was only, I can count on one hand, there was no more than 5 of us, black clinicians at any given one time, in that whole on that whole prison that I can recall. And so, when you're a minority in a white driven space like that, unfortunately, those tables can turn whether you're good or not, just for the simple fact that you're a minority. And people, that culture, is definitely is not in favor of minorities. And not to make this a racial issue, but a lot of times I feel like corrections can be a microcosm of what goes on in the real world, especially politically. And so you have people that are like, I don't care about politically correct. I don't care about what's on those boards about labor and fair treatment and things like that. There's people work around that and do what they can to poke the bear, so to speak. But there is definitely a competition. There's definitely an undercutting. There's definitely sabotaging. And given the type of field that you work in, it could actually be very dangerous, at times. Luckily, I had a good rapport with most of the inmates there. Maybe only a couple out of my entire career. But if you that I think that's kind of the saving grace. It's like I really did enjoy the work with them, and had good rapport, and so that was fine. But man, your colleagues can definitely create hell on earth for you. With their competitiveness, their jealousy, their envy, right? Because they view you as becoming successful. They're very envious of that. Thank you for mentioning this, because this is a very real